Welcome to Chapter 6 recording of Human Anatomy. And today we're going to be talking about skeletal tissue as we move on to the skeletal system. So I'll begin by sharing my screen and beginning our lecture. All right, moving into Chapter 6. So we'll begin as we start the skeletal system to talk about cartilage. And remember that as we begin to talk about cartilage, as the human develops in utero, all of those bones begin as cartilage. And as you can see here in this image, what's amazing, at even a few weeks old, all of those bones begin out in fetal development as cartilage. So even at a few weeks of age, I believe this fetus image is taken at about 12 weeks of age. You can see all of those long bones developed. You can see the femur here, you can see the humerus and how they're all developed. And eventually those cartilage develop into those long bones. So they slowly are replaced into bone. And where flexibility is required, that remains as cartilage. So in those joints and other areas. So there are different types of cartilage that we'll learn about, but skeletal cartilage is really highly resilient. And important key thing to remember here is that cartilage does not have blood vessels or nerves, okay? And because it lacks that blood vessel, that's what really hinders it in as far as repairing. Remember, as we break down the words, perichondrium, so the peri means surrounding. So this is that layer of dense connective tissue surrounding the cartilage. So acting like a girdle. And the key thing, it's helping resist that outward expansion, but it's what's supplying the blood vessels and delivering the nutrients to the cartilage. And when we think about the cells that make up the cartilage, once again, thinking about the word breaking down, sites referring to the cells and chondro referring to cartilage. So those are the cells that make up cartilage. There are three types of cartilage that we'll be looking at, and these are three that you should be familiar with. There is hyaline, elastic, and fibro. We talked a little bit about these when we looked at the different types of tissue. Hyaline is going to be the most common that you're going to find throughout your body. These are the ones you're going to find throughout your joints, in your fingers and other areas throughout your body. Also in your costal ribs, in your larynx and tip of your nose. This is kind of really abundant throughout your body. It's very flexible, resilient, mainly consisting of those collagen fibers. So that's your hyaline cartilage. So when in doubt, it's going to be your hyaline cartilage. And there's two other types that are a little more specific and only found in unique areas of your body. The second type is elastic cartilage, and those are only found in your ear and your epiglottis. So the epiglottis is at the edge of your larynx, and that's what closes off the larynx and the pharynx, making sure that food doesn't go down into your esophagus. And then, of course, your ear, that really flexible, broad base of the pinna. So those types of cartilage are very broad, contain elastic fibers, and so they're quite different from the hyaline cartilage that you typically find in those joints. And then the last one is fibrocartilage. Here you can think of the really thick cartilage, the one in between your vertebral discs, those really thick pads that are in between your vertebra. And then of course the thick menisci that is in between your knees. So the knee is a very specialized joint, different from all the other joints. Compare that to your elbow and hips and so forth. And here, the fibrocartilage is very thick. Okay, so as we look at the different types of cartilage, you can see the three are color-coded. So the fibrocartilage is the one here in the menisci, and in the very specific areas of the body. And also in the pubic symphysis is the other place that you would find it. The elastic cartilage, as we mentioned, in your ear and in the epiglottis, right there above the larynx, okay? And the hyaline cartilage is pretty much everywhere else throughout the body. And when we look at the function, we're now moving on to the bones. So that is covering the cartilage. We're now looking at the bones, and we'll first talk about the function of the bones, and then we'll look into the different types of bones, and then we'll look into the different shapes of them and how the bones we'll look at the structure of the bones. So looking first at the function, think about the 7 functions of the bone. First of all, when we think of bones, often it is support of the bones and protecting those soft organs inside. Think of protection, certainly of the brain and spinal cord and all those vital organs inside. But also think about movement. It protects, basically is giving leverage to all those muscles. So when you think about moving your arm, those skeletal muscles couldn't move. It wasn't for those muscles that offer the attachment for those skeletal muscles. It's a really important storage for all the minerals such as calcium and phosphorus and allow us to grow. Certainly for blood formation. And then also it's there for fat storage and also hormone production as well. So it is, when we circle back and study the endocrine system, we'll be looking at bones as well. It is considered an endocrine organ. All right, in your body, there are 206 bones. And yes, we'll be studying all 206. And hopefully you'll be able to name all 206. That's your goal. And the key is that we divide them up into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So axial, think of an axis. So a top spinning on the axis. Think of your earth spinning on an axis. So think of something long and thin. So your head and your spine, that is the axis, okay, along with the ribs. So that is the axis. And in this diagram here, you can see it's in the darker orange color. That is your axial skeleton. And then your appendicular skeleton. Think of an appendix as something after the fact. In a book, the appendix is always at the end, right? Your appendix is at the end of your small intestine. It's kind of after the fact. Well, those are your limbs, so those are afterwards. So your axial skeleton is the most vital thing. You can't really live without your spine, right? But you can live without your limbs. So that's how you can remember the difference, okay? So the appendicular skeleton contains all of your upper and lower limbs, and then the girdles that attach them, your pelvic and pectoral girdles that attach them. So when we study them in chapter 7, we first look at all the axial bones, first starting with the skull and working our way down the vertebra and then to the ribs. And then we study the appendicular skeleton, starting with the upper limbs and then moving down to the lower limbs. So that's the order we progress in. In order to study the bones, we want to study the different shapes first. And you want to be able to classify all your bones into the different shapes. So there are 4 different types of bones. And the first one is long bones. So kind of obvious, those are the bones that are longer in your body, and you might think of, well, that must be the femur, that must be the humerus, that must be, all your arm bones and your leg bones. But there's other bones too. It actually contains all of those little finger bones as well. So it's the bones that are longer than they are wide. Okay, so it is basically all of your limb bones. So if the bone is longer than it is wide, then it is considered a long bone. So it does contain all of the phalanges. Then second, it would be the short bones. Those are the cube-shaped bones. Those are basically all the bones in your wrists and your ankles. Okay, includes the sesamoid bones. So for instance, the patella, the little bone that is on your kneecap. Bones that are contained within the tendons, okay? And they will vary in size, number, but they are small little bones. They are the harder bones, And typically I won't make you name as many of all the small little bones. Okay, so definitely you'll get to be familiar with all the long bones. You won't have to memorize as many of the short little bones. Then comes all the flat bones. Those are thin and flat, as the name would indicate. That might include your sternum on your chest, the scapula, ribs, and pretty much all the bones in your skull. And then there are those irregular bones, and as the name would indicate, those are just kind of your weird looking bones. They have no other group to go into. That's your vertebra, hip bones that just are weird looking, okay? So you should be able to look at any bone and know what group it would go into. How would you classify it? So once again, those long bones are easy to classify. Those little wrist bones and all of the carpals and tarsals, those are easy to put into groups. And then of course, flat bones, like the name would indicate. But then you want to think about, well, what about these irregular ones? Think of those too. Then we want to think about how the bone is actually structured and what does it look like. And on that level, there's what we call the gross and microscopic and chemical. In this class, we're going to break down and go into the gross level and the microscopic. I'm not going to talk about the chemical level. Okay, so this is what I'll be going into. Key thing to remember when we're talking about terminology, whenever you see the prefix or suffix of os, you know you're talking about bone. Okay. Do you remember that a bone is an organ? Okay. It's a type of tissue. But it also has, you know, nervous tissue in with it. There's cartilage. There is connective tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, blood vessels, all of this within it. So it's a really complicated organ because it contains so many other tissues within it. Okay, first thing to remember when we look at it on the bigger scale, the gross anatomy of it, we have compact bone versus spongy bone. So we've all had chicken in our life or ribs or whatever, and I'm sure you've examined what bones look like, right? And you may have noticed that on the outside, it's kind of smooth. And when you break it apart, it's got all these little holes inside. Okay? And you may have wondered, well, what goes through all those little holes? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so the hard part, the part that's very dense is called the compact bone. And that's the outer layer of the bone, or the part that appears smooth. Then this inside part, what we call the honeycomb, and there's a word for it called trabeculae. And that's a word that you should be really familiar with because that word comes up again in anatomy. It refers to anything that is honeycomb-like. When we go to later on, when we talk about cardiovascular system, there's a muscle, trabeculae carneae, that refers to in the heart, that refers to this honeycomb muscle. So be familiar with that word. It does come up again in anatomy. But it's basically this open space here is what's going to be filled with bone marrow. So both the yellow and red bone marrow fills up in this spongy bone. So it's a network that allows the bone marrow to filter through. When we look at short and irregular and flat bones, they have that outer layer of compact bone and the spongy bone in between, just like we saw here. So when you look at the skull, for instance, that's what you're going to see is this outer layer with spongy bone in between. That's kind of typical for most of your bones. Okay, so those three types, the short, irregular, and flat bones, that's going to be kind of the makeup of those. And what you also have is the periosteum and endosteum. So once again, breaking down this word, osteum is always going to refer to bone. Peri, remember that means surrounding the outside. So this is going to be the membrane, the connective tissue that surrounds the outside of the bone. And then endio is going to refer to the inside. And I have a slide coming up that'll show you what that looks like. So this is the connective tissue that surrounds the outside and the inside of that compact bone. And then bone marrow is scattered through the spongy bone, okay? And then hyaline cartilage, remember that's going to be your most abundant cartilage throughout the body, right? That's the ones in most of your joints. That's covering that movable joint area, okay? So, when you're looking at your small bones or anywhere else, that's going to be covering that outer joint area. Then when you look at a long bone, their structure is quite different than your short bones and your flat bones and others. Okay? They have a very different structure, very specialized. They have some different areas. One, they have a long shaft. So if you think of your long leg bones, you know that shaft. If you had a gnawing on a chicken leg, you know what I'm talking about. They have what's called the diaphysis. And the end is the epiphysis, and they have also different membranes as well. So the diaphysis is the tubular shaft, and it's forming the axis of the bone. Okay? The compact bone is going to be, it's going to form the long tube, and on the inside is the yellow marrow. And I'll show you an image in a moment. And then the epiphysis is what's on the end of the compact bone. And there's a line, and this is basically where it grows. So let me show you. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So this is your typical long bone. This could be your humerus. This could be your femur, okay? So this is hollow in here, okay? And this is what's going to be filled with that yellow marrow. So this is compact bone, and on the inside, on the tip of it is going to be the spongy bone. This is the epiphyseal line. This is what's growing. Okay, so this is the proximal epiphysis. This is the distal epiphysis. So proximal being close to your body. So let's say this is the humerus. This is the ball that's going to be near your shoulder. This is going to be distal. So this is going to be down near your radius and ulna. It's going to be near your elbow. Okay. So this is the diaphysis. That's going to be the shaft of your main arm. So this hollow area is going to be filled with the bone marrow. And when we do a close-up, we're going to see this trabeculae. And inside of it is a network of all your blood vessels. And there's going to be red and yellow bone marrow going throughout. Okay. And then this is the epiphyseal line, and this is where the bone grows. Okay. And at some point when you hit, when you stop growing, this epiphyseal line seals off. So that's when you stop growing. So when you hit, 18 or whatever, when your body stops growing, this seals off and it no longer grows. Okay. The periosteum, and I have another image that'll show this a little closer. The periosteum is what's going to be on the outside, is going to be on the outside, that membrane. And hold off till I'll show you the next image. That's what's going to be the periosteum, and the endosteum is what's going to be on the inside. So the two membranes, the periosteum is a double layer, and that's covering the whole outer surface. So have you ever noticed when you go to eat, whether it's ribs, whether it's chicken or something, there's always this like white layer that's on the bones when you're eating them. And what you're looking at is periosteum. Okay, so the next time you're eating, any type of food that is on a bone, okay, notice that white lining, and what you're looking at is periosteum. And it's that periosteum, it contains the nerve fibers and the blood vessels that help also supply that bone as well. And it also allows anchoring for tendons and ligaments. Okay, so you may have noticed that too when you're eating ligaments and tendons. Okay, then there is the endosteum. Okay, remember endo meaning inside, and that's the tissue that's covering the whole inside of that trabeculae, and it's lining all the canals of that spongy tissue. So here's another picture. So here's the periosteum. Okay, so that's the periosteum, and that allows all those blood vessels to be kind of lining the inside. And then there's the endosteum. So that allows all the blood vessels on the inside. And there's the yellow marrow that's is on the inside of just the diaphysis of the long bone. Okay, next we're going to talk about what are called bone markings. And this is a really important part when you're learning bone tissues, because to learn the different sites on bones, this is where muscles attach, where ligaments attach, tendons attach. And to know these, this will help you then when we get to muscles, you'll have to know origin and insertion of a whole bunch of different muscles. So if you know these bone markings, then it'll make a whole lot more sense. Okay, so to know these general terms on bones will really help. Okay, so it's basically, you'll understand, oh, that's where this joint is formed. And oh, that's where this blood vessel goes in. That's where this nerve goes in. So when we get to these later chapters, when we study blood vessels and nerves and joints, it makes a whole lot more sense. Okay, so they kind of go into three different categories. There's projections. So basically that's anything on the bone that goes out, that bulges out. Okay, and it could be because, muscles pulling, it's a part where the muscle pulls on. A depression means it's going down. It could be an area where the muscle is holding onto, or where a blood vessel might go through, or a nerve might go through. And then there's an opening, an actual hole or a canal. So those are kind of three ways that they categorize it in. This table is in your book. So definitely one of the tables, it's 6.1, and you definitely want to study it. Okay. This is of table 0.1. It focuses on projections first. Okay. I've highlighted the ones that I think come up more often, so that you see definitely more often, okay? So of these projections, crest, you'll definitely see more often. So for instance, here is the hip, and there is the iliac crest. So of the hip bone, this is the iliac bone. There's several bones that make up this hip, and the iliac crest. So this is the crest. You can think the crest of a mountain. This is the crest of that. Okay, tubercle. This is a small rounded process or projection. Okay, and I think of the tubercle down here. So here is your femur, and this is the tubercle right down here. So this is the ball of the femur. So that's what would go into your hip. That would go right into there. And this is the tubercle. Okay. Epicondyle, okay, so similar to a condyle comes up a lot too, which isn't on this list, I just realized. So condyle and epicondyle, you should have definitely both those terms on your list. So there's epicondyle and condyle, definitely learn both of those. And that basically means a raised area next to, so epi means near, and condyle. So recognize those two. And then spine, similar to a crest, that's going to come up as well. Okay, and then, and then process. Process means anything that points out. So your vertebral process, this is the spinal process. And when we get to the vertebra, we're going to be looking at the processes quite a bit. So those are ones to remember there. All right. Next, we're looking at, oh, there's the condyle. So we're continuing on points out. So head, so like the head of the femur, that's the ball of it. So going back here, that's the head of the femur. Okay. And then condyle, as I mentioned, that's one that comes up a lot. And then ramus. Ramus, oh, there's a condyle. There's another one for the jawbone. And there's the head of the rib. And then ramus is another one that's an arm like projection. And you can use that in the jawbone. So those are ones that come up more often out of that list. Okay, these are depressions and openings. So these are ones that I've highlighted that come up more often. Fissure, so that's a narrow slit. And there are a lot of fissures that we're going to be studying when we get to the skull. So you'll definitely want to be familiar with the different fissures. Foramen, I remember that one. So foramen is basically a hole, and there's a lot of holes that blood vessels and nerves are going to go through. So I remember that because when we think of the big holes that are in the street, we call those manholes, and it's for a man. So that's how I remember it. Foramen, for a man, manhole. So that's my way of remembering it. And medius or meatus, and I just think of that as like a meteor hole, like a meteor would leave a hole, and it's usually like bigger than a foramen. It's like really meaty, and that's the canal. So like a foramen might be that little bitty hole, like right there, okay? But the foramen, or sorry, the meatus is like, I don't show it right here, but that's like your canal is a meatus. It's pretty big, okay? And the fossa is a shallow like basin. So that can be anywhere, you know, like more of a basin or a shallow indentation. And then sinus, I guess I should have highlighted that. We are going to be memorizing the different sinuses of the skull as well. All right, so those are definitely important. Study that table, and that will make your life a lot easier when we get to, as I mentioned, the muscles, and when we get to also studying the blood vessels and nerves as well. So definitely be familiar with that terminology. All right, so to touch on the microscopic anatomy of bones, here you want to be familiar once again with the terminology and breaking apart these words. So once again, osteo, anything referring to osteo is always going to refer to bone. And I talked when we were in the tissue, chapter, remember blast, anything blast always refers to, I think a blast is baby. So that's growth, that's things that are building or young. Cyte means cell, so those are mature. And then some other terms here, osteoclast. I always think of clast as clay building or remodeling. So those are the reabsorbing cells that are rebuilding. And then osteogenetic, those are stem cells. So think of like genetic cells, stem cell research. That's how I always remember that one. So those are terms that you will see coming up as we read through chapters. Okay, so I probably won't quiz you on those 5, but definitely be familiar with those terms because you'll see it come up in your reading. And those are just cool pictures of our different cells. All right, but what you should be familiar with is these images, because it'll really help you as we learn the different bones and to know how they're structured. So when we look at a compact bone, you want to be familiar with the different components of it and how it's built. Okay? A compact bone, also known as a lamar bone, has these different constituents. So it has something called an osteon. So each of these little round parts is called an osteon. And the way it's built allows it to have this amazing structure to maintain a lot of force. So if you notice, each one of these little round parts, the osteon, has a hole in the middle. And through that hole is going to be a network of blood vessels. So you've got your arteries and veins, but also your nerves running through that osteon. So that little tube is protecting the very fragile arteries, veins, and nerves running through there. So it's protecting it, and it protects it in a way, this cylinder basically protects it and withstands that pressure. So the other cool thing is it's, notice that the collagen fibers run in different directions, allowing it to withstand any twisting force. So it's pretty amazing how that is built. So once again, I'll go back to that. So if you look at a cross section of a bone, you'll see all these little holes. And once again, that's what the blood vessels and the nerves are running through. And each one of these is an individual unit. Each one of these is an individual osteon running through that. So when you look at a compact bone, it's built up of hundreds of these little osteons. And then there is this spongy bone in the center there. So each osteon is a structural unit of the compact bone, and it runs parallel to the axis of the bone, and it allows for that weight bearing. So it's pretty amazing how it allows it to withstand the stress and the twisting of it. Last part we'll look at is the developmental aspects of the bone. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, bones start out as cartilage, and then over time it ossifies. So most long bones begin to ossify somewhere between like week 8 and then begin to, around week 12. So that's how, when they look at ultrasounds, they can look at the rate of ossification, and they can tell how many weeks old the fetus is. So they can tell it from x-rays, sonograms, and so forth. They can tell the age of the fetus by that ossification. At birth, most bones are ossified, but there's still these epiphyseal plates have not ossified all the way, and they will remain, the epiphyseal plates will be persistent through adolescence, and so they don't begin to ossify until puberty hits. So if you've ever held a baby, they have the soft spot. So what's interesting is when you're first born, you're born with a whole lot more bones than compared to an adult. So when you look at a baby's skull, there's a whole bunch more bones, and then they ossify, they begin to fuse as they get older. And then by the age of 25, all your bones are completely ossified and you no longer grow, okay? So if you were hoping, to gain a couple more inches and you're already 25, sorry, so I'm already in my 50s. I'm not gonna grow, I'm shrinking at this point, okay? So that's it as far as growing once you hit 25. Now, as far as children and adolescents, bone formation exceeds reabsorption. So when you're a child and you're adolescent, you're just completely, the formation is just growing. They're growing like weeds, right? And boys definitely have more mass than females as far as women, as far as more bone mass, and they grow. And when you become a young adult, there's a balance of the bone formation and as far as the reabsorption. So you've kind of a balance. But as soon as you get an adult, once you hit 25, then your bone starts to reabsorb and you're no longer forming. So as soon as you hit 25, you start to absorb more bone than you are forming. Sorry. So what happens as you get older? Well, how much bone, how your bone density changes will depend on your genetics. So did your grandmother or grandfather have osteoporosis? That will impact how your bones will change as you get older. The bone mass and mineralization, that will definitely change. And with females, menopause really changes the amount of your mineralization. And definitely once you hit your 40s, there's a big change in that. And it all is impacted except for the skull. So you don't see that change in the skull, but all the long bones and so forth are impacted by that. And with white females, you get even greater bone loss. So when I hit 40, I started taking calcium every day. Exercise is really important. Helping keep that bone growth, from subside, the bone demineralization and degeneration from minimizing. So it's really important once you hit your 40s to do that. Got to stay healthy. So with that, page 194 is your chapter summary. And these are 2 videos. I will probably try to show these in class. One is put on by Health Education and Training, and that goes over kind of what we talked about, the bone types. And then, of course, my favorite physiologist, Crash Course, he goes over the basics of bones. And hopefully I'll be able to have time to show those in class. If I don't, those are the links. And I hope you have enjoyed learning about Chapter 6. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. All right, bye.